Statistics Lab at the University of Toronto, working with Professor Amer Shalaby. His research and professional interests focus on applying statistical methods to evaluate public transit ridership and performance metrics using a variety of emerging data sources, enabling the design and implementation of better transit services. He received his BASc in civil engineering from University of Waterloo, specializing in transportation systems and statistics. He enjoys cycling and playing the clarinet. So he's going to present his thesis for about 50 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. First, the professors will ask questions, and then we're going to open the floor for the rest of the audience, if that's all right. So please welcome Roger Chen.
All right, thank you, everyone. And thanks, Sam, for the introduction, so I don't have to say my introduction again. So yeah, my thesis is titled Investigating Post-Pandemic Ridership Recovery Trends in the Subway Ridership of the Toronto Subway System. So so just what to expect. Here's the outline. I'm going to start by talking about introducing some of the objectives of this research. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data processing and the methodology we adopted for that, and then I'll jump into some results, so some exploratory stuff, and then some results from time series modeling, as well as a little bit of future forecasting that we did. And then we'll end by talking about some conclusions and some sort of future directions for the work. So in terms of objectives, first of all, at the most basic level, we want to understand the shape of the post-COVID ridership recovery, specifically in the context of the Toronto subway system. We want to look at where and when riders are returning to transit. We want to quantify these trends, both in terms of general behaviors as well as sort of interesting differences between different subsectors. And of course, we also want to compare how recovery is progressing differently or similarly across different parts of the city or different times of day, for example. So moving on to what has been seen elsewhere as a result of COVID. So obviously, COVID has had very significant impacts on transit usage in general across around the world, obviously. Across these, there have been some broader trends that have been observed. So, for example, literature has shown differences in where riders are returning. For example, downtown areas were typically more severely affected by the advent of COVID compared to suburban areas. We see differences in when riders are returning. So, in terms of recovery, especially, it's like weekday 9 to 5 sort of downtown focused commuting that is not recovered, whereas off-peak and especially weekends have seen a lot of riders come back in greater numbers. We also see differences in which riders are returning to transit or have continued to use transit. So literature has found that, for example, low-income, essential workers, those sorts of demographics tend to use transit more consistently over the course of the pandemic, whereas more affluent, like office commuters especially, are the ones that sort of left transit and sort of largely still stayed away from transit to some extent. Like I said, these are very general statements, so we want to also go into more detail and look at how we can use data to quantify and further monitor these trends. So I'll talk about some of the data processing and the methodology we adopted now. So this research uses Wi-Fi data from the Toronto subway, and we adopted the Wi-Fi data because it provides a number of advantages for this analysis. So first of all, it's like all big data sources, it's collected passively at a large scale across the whole system, which means that we get a lot of data at a very low cost, which is obviously beneficial for having a lot of possible data to analyze. One unique aspect about the Wi-Fi data is that we actually trace the riders through their entire journey through the subway system. So we get their exact route as well as both their origin and their destination, which is actually something that is more poorly covered or not able to be directly derived from a number of other more traditional data sources. A further advantage is that we can associate devices with, or we can associate different trips with individual devices because we have a unique anonymized ID that's associated with each device, and that lets us observe how individuals' travel behavior varies between trips. So we can see how frequently they're using the system, for example. Some other advantages of this data for like a more practical setting would be we can set it up to provide a very continuous data stream so that if we implement this in an industry setting, we can perform analysis in essentially real time, which is obviously very beneficial for operations control. Another advantage is that because all of the records are anonymized, this can mitigate some privacy concerns that are associated with, for example, smart card data or cell GPS records. And also will show it's a fairly good ridership proxy just based on the raw Wi-Fi data itself. despite the fact that it's only sampling a portion of subway riders. So that's good because it obviously gives higher accuracy and it reduces the calibration needs when we're working with this kind of data. So just in terms of some numbers for this data, we collected data from August 2020 until December 2023, so about 3 years of post-COVID data. We also collected, we also have some data from fall 2019 as well, so that serves as our pre-COVID baseline. We collected data from the whole system, so all 75 subway stations that were active for most of the study period. There are 855 access points spread across the system, so an average of 12, but that varies based on the station. We collected 100 million device journeys that were processed, and these were constructed from 3 billion device connection or disconnection records. So a lot of data that that was processed to get this analysis. So how we collect this data is through the T-Connect. So if you use a subway and you're connected to the Wi-Fi on the subway, the T-Connect is the network that you connect to. And the device on the right there, that's what the physical access point looks like. So these are located in each station, usually on the ceiling of the platform or the concourse. And this is basically the router that your phone connects to. And this is what actually collects the data. So this is what there are 855 of across the network. And for a little more detail about how exactly we collect this data, so as you can see, there's Wi-Fi access points throughout the system, or throughout the station, throughout each station in the system. So let's say a rider enters the subway system with their Wi-Fi enabled device, and when they enter the system, their device connects to the nearest access point, in this case at the station entrance level. Then as they move through the system, or as they move through the station, their device continually disconnects and reconnects to the next closest device. So we can look at their exact path through the station, from the entrance to the concourse to the platform, where you wait for the train. When you're on the train, your device continuously reconnects at every station you pass through, so we can know the exact route that you took in terms of which stations you passed through. And finally, when you get to your destination, the reverse happens. So you connect to the platform level, then the concourse, and finally the exit of the station. And then you leave the system, and so then you leave the system, there's a disconnection, and after a given period of time, about 15 minutes I believe, then we consider that trip closed, and we take that string of device. Yes?
Well, I just want to know, do you have to actively connect? Or is it just the connection,
it's
like the automatic part of it?
It's automatic. If you ever log on to T-Connect before, then every time you come within range, it'll do this. So you don't actually have to be like connected.
Because when I want to use the Wi-Fi, I have to go through the process, and it's a bit of a pain, and it's slow, and so you don't have to do that.
No, yeah.
Good.
Yeah, because if we did that, the capture would be much lower.
Yeah, me too.
I assume.
Yeah, thank you.
But yeah, so we take those records and we string them together into one device journey, and that's the basic unit of our analysis. So just to conceptualize how we did the analysis, we started with Wi-Fi data and used it to construct these device journeys, as I just explained. And it turns out that using just the device journeys without any other supplementary data actually gives you some pretty interesting insights. So that's what most of the exploratory analysis will be about, just from the device journeys themselves and sort of by slicing them in different interesting ways. But we also, there's also some variations in the capture rate, especially as time goes on, for various reasons. So when we move on to our time series modeling, we first aggregated the Wi-Fi data into, or we combined it with Fargate data, so entries and exits measured at like Presto gates at each station. So we combined these to make OD matrices for the whole system for each day of our analysis period. Then we aggregated them into broader regions because there's some variation between stations. So by aggregating them into larger sort of sections of the city, we're able to get results that are more interpretable. And then from those, we can take those numbers and fit the time series and sort of dissect and interpret them however we like. And just want to go a little bit more detail about how we construct the OD matrices. So we start with Wi-Fi data. We attribute mutation that's constructing the device journeys. And then we use those to create what we call a seed matrix, which is basically just an OD matrix of the raw count of device journeys, so without any further processing, which is the pink square basically. And then we use the Fargate data as basically control totals or as a ground truth. We take that as the actual correct number of people who entered and exited each station on each day. And then we use those as the, so those are the row and column sums. And then we use just iterative biproportional updating to expand the seed matrix to match the row and column sums that are from the fair data. And from that we get what's called a balance matrix, and we use the balance matrix to feed the time series analyses. I don't think I have to introduce the Toronto subway system. So that's the Toronto subway system, if you're not aware. Just want to highlight as well, I mean, yeah, you guys know where this is downtown, but I'll be talking about downtown a lot, so I just want to make sure we're on the same page. And I was mentioned the regional breakdown earlier, where we aggregated the 75 stations into 10 regions. So this is what that looks like. So region 1 is at the bottom, it's downtown. And then the other regions were split up sort of based on a combination of like network topology, travel patterns, land use, just to create results that are sort of interpretable and make a logical sense in the context of how the transportation system in the city works. Yeah, so we'll start by jumping into some exploratory results now. So we should probably start by talking about the overall shape of recovery. So here's a plot of recovery measured from, in yellow, that's the recovery in terms as measured from just raw device journeys. And in green, it's what the TTC has been reporting on a monthly basis through their monthly Ridership reports. So the main thing I wanted to sort of take away here is that there's a fairly remarkable degree of correlation between the two curves, and that sort of provides evidence that even just without any further processing, the Wi-Fi data provides a reasonably good proxy for overall ridership. And I should note that for the most exploratory analyses, they go up until fall 2022. That was just because of some technical limitations of the data stream. But for the time series analyses, those go for the full time series. Anyway, yes, I also want to plot this is downtown office occupancy collected by the SRRA, which is like a different organization that focuses on office occupancy research. And in treating that as a proxy for downtown office commuting, you can see that it's much lower than the rest of the system for this entire period. And so that points to because it's such a big travel market, at least before COVID, it begs the question of if people aren't going to the office, then what is driving this ridership growth? So digging into this a bit further, the map on the right shows ridership recovery at a station level up until fall 2022 compared to 2019. We can immediately see that there's some heterogeneity between different stations in the system, and we can start to think about this in terms of which riders are returning to transit and who isn't. So for example, we see stations along the east leg of line 1, we actually see, I don't know how well the contrast shows up here, but these stations are actually some of the least, or have some of the lowest recoveries all of the whole system. It's about 60% on average for these stations, compared to the system as a whole, which is at about 74%. Meanwhile, if we look at stations on line 2, we see much higher recovery than this average, about 80% on average. So we can think about why is this the case, what explains these differences, and is this due to, for example, maybe the demographics that use these stations. So we correlated this with some TTS data. So the TTS is the travel survey that covers the whole greater Toronto area. So this is from the most recent one in 2016. And we look at variables that we know elsewhere affect transit ridership, such as household income, the sector of employment, like white collar versus blue collar, and access to personal vehicles. And we see that in all these cases, people who use line 1 stations tend to be wealthier, tend to be employed in white collar jobs, and tend to have greater access to a personal vehicle compared to the system-wide average. And we see the reverse is true for line 2 stations. So this points to, this is consistent with what has been seen elsewhere in the literature, and so it provides sort of a little bit further confidence in these results being consistent with what other cities are seeing as well. In terms of turning now to looking at where the ridership is recovering. So this is after breaking out the system into the 10 regions. This is just a matrix of recovery by each OD pair within the region, within the system. With, again, downtown highlighted, region 1. So there's a couple things we can note there. Compared to the system-wide average, which is 71%, the downtown is sort of lagging behind compared to other regions. And this is especially the case with travel between downtown and the suburbs, only about 60%. Conversely, we see that the regions with the strongest recovery tend to be in the suburbs, such as region 10, and actually all much later on, I'll talk a little bit about why Region 10 has been seeing this. We can drill down a little bit further. So this is looking at daily Wi-Fi device journey starts for specific stations over the course of this period. So this is for Union Station. So overall, it matches. So in the case of Union Station, it matches the system-wide trajectory quite well. That's because Union Station is it's one of the busiest stations in the network, and it sees a very diverse mix of trip purposes. And so for those reasons, it tends to reflect what's happening on the system as a whole fairly well. Something I want to mention is the fact that the Union Station, particularly during summer 2022, it saw almost 100% recovery, which is a lot earlier than we saw for most other stations on the network. So we might think about why Union Station specifically. Our sort of reason for this is that, as I'll show later on, discretionary travel has been a lot of what's driving ridership growth since COVID. And Union Station in particular is it's a pretty big destination for that. You have Harborfront, you have sport and concert venues. So those are the kinds of destinations that really drive that kind of discretionary travel. And the summer especially is when people tend to travel for those purposes. So that's what we think is driving this trend in Union Station specifically. Now if we contrast it with something like King Station, so King Station is right beside Union, obviously, but the ridership base is very different because much of it is right beside the financial district, so most of the riders there are office workers. And so we'll notice, first of all, that overall recovery is much lower than Union Station's, and we're about 50%. So we can also see this in terms of very large variations within the week. So because there's much less ridership on weekends, just because there's a relative lack of destinations in that area compared to on weekdays. As I said. Third station I want to look at is Dundas Station. So Dundas Station, like Union Station, also seems a fairly diverse set of trip purposes. But what's unique about Dundas is that it serves two particular destinations for its ridership. One of them is the Eaton Center, so a big mall. The other one is TNU, formerly Ryerson, so a major university. And we can see the impact of this reflected here. For example, you can pinpoint almost to the date when indoor shopping reopened after COVID. In July 2021, when people suddenly are coming back to Dundas Station, back to the Eaton Center, so they can go shopping. And we can also see that in-person lectures at Ryerson resumed in fall 2022, and we see another fairly large drop in ridership at the station as a result. So yeah, this is a pretty good example of how we can identify these unique elements of each station through the Wi-Fi data. Okay, so turning now to the question of when our riders are returning. So this is the same plot of recovery by OD pair, but this is just for the weekday AM peak only, so trips from 6 to 9 a.m. basically. So basically just commuting trips. And we can see that the differences we saw earlier are even starker here. So downtown is lagging behind even further now compared to the rest of the system. And especially some of these OD pairs are like under 50%. I don't know how well you can see these, but that's like 46, 43. So very far behind line average. And conversely, again, it's these suburban regions, especially like Region 10, which are seeing a much stronger ridership recovery, and some of them have almost, they've even exceeded 100% already, even as early as fall 2022. Now, I want you guys to remember this when I flip over to Saturdays. So we can see that the distribution has changed substantially. Something I want to call out is that, first of all, ridership recovery is much higher overall in the system as a whole, so 94% compared to 67%. The other thing is that if we compare downtown to the system as a whole, unlike on weekday peak periods when there was a significant gap, here they're almost identical. So there's clearly something that's driving this ridership recovery to downtown on weekends that isn't happening on weekdays. So digging down again, this is essentially a minute-by-minute plot of when people enter the subway system at, in this case, Union Station. And I plotted this for 2019 in yellow, and then for 2020, 2021, and 2022. So Union Station, you can very clearly see the morning and PM peak periods. But something that's fairly unique to Union is that we see a third peak late in the evening. And our explanation for this is that this corresponds to when a lot of special events let out at things like Scotiabank Arena, Rogers Center. So that drives a lot of ridership as well, sort of late in the evening, where it doesn't in a lot of other stations. What's also interesting about this is that unlike for the AM and PM commuting peaks, the height of these peaks are almost identical between 2019 and 2022. So this suggests that it's, this ridership is really returned much more strongly compared to, again, the peak commuting ridership. So this is further evidence of those findings. And we can again contrast this with King Station, where we can again see clearly defined AM and PM peaks, but just the gap is so much, there's still a significant gap between 2022 and 2019 levels, as you can see. And for Dundas Station, this is another instance where sort of the unique mix of destinations is revealed through the Wi-Fi data. So first of all, because it's not as employment heavy, we don't see the same clear AM and PM peak periods as King Station or Union Station. Instead, sort of demand builds gradually over the day. You might also notice these spikes that happen every hour on the hour, and our most likely hypothesis is that it corresponds to when classes start and end at Ryerson, or at TNU. So that's when all the students are coming out and taking the subway home. So yeah, it's interesting to be able to see these sort of very specific effects reflected in this data. Let's talk about downtown a little bit more, just comparing different stations within downtown and how those differences vary between different time periods. So this is recovery for each station in downtown, looking again only at the weekday PM peak. And I'll highlight just again that the Evangel District stations like St. Andrew, King, Osgood see like the lowest recovery of the whole area. If we contrast this, so remember this again, as I flip to Saturdays, we see that the distribution is suddenly very different. And especially I want to highlight, Osgood and St. Andrew, are these stations here. They went from the worst performing stations to the best performing when we look at weekends instead. Exactly. And our hypothesis for this is that, if you know that area, on one side you have the office buildings, and on the other side you have the entertainment district. And that's theaters, restaurants, nightclubs, all this sort of discretionary travel which people go to on weekends and on weekdays. And so that is really explaining why, these stations, what's driving the ridership to these stations on weekends, but not on weekdays. Okay, so last slide from my exploratory analysis. This is going back to, I mentioned earlier, one of the advantages of the Wi-Fi is we can track people's activity on system between different trips. So we can use this, for example, to measure how many days per week are people using the subway. And specifically for this, we're looking at just downtown stations in the PM peak. So basically, this is kind of a proxy for how many days a week are people going into the office, approximately. Before COVID, the average even then wasn't quite 5 days. It was more common to do 4 or 3 days a week, at least being observed in the subway during this period. But after COVID, we can see that it's shifted to mostly 1 or 2 days per week, as expected, because a lot of people are working from home now, and there's a lot more flexibility in terms of remote work modalities. Something else that's interesting to note is that the average frequency of commuting has sort of stayed the same throughout the pandemic. It's average 2 to 2.5 days per week, and that's been consistent since 2020 until late 2022. And so as there's been this kind of push and pull between employers and employees about how many days do we return to the office, how many days a week do we mandate. It shows that despite this whole debate, people are still not really going into the office that often. So something interesting to think about when we talk about these discussions. Obviously, this only goes until 2022, but unfortunately we couldn't extend this analysis, but it will be interesting to look at how that's continuing further. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the time series modeling now. So there are a number of common models that are used for time series modeling. The one we adopted was called Profit. It's developed by a couple of data scientists who work at Facebook. It's essentially a modular regression model that's based on the time series decomposition. So taking a time series and breaking it down in terms of the trend, in terms of components like the trend. The trend is the overall where the time series is going after we remove sort of various other effects. There's seasonality, so that's variations that recur over time. So things like variations by day of week or variations over the course of a year. Holidays are something that's kind of unique to Profit, but it's how it handles, as the name suggests, like holidays. So it's sort of one-off days where some variable might be different compared to like a typical weekday, for example. We can also use the holidays to model things like data outages. So there were a handful of dates where we had no recorded device journeys, so we can account for those without biasing the overall trend. or things like lockdowns. So for example, the Omicron wave, there was like a brief 2-week lockdown where everyone went home and then everyone came back suddenly. So all these lets us handle that without unduly biasing the overall trend and other components. And we have an error term, of course. So in terms of why we adopted the profit model, so profit was originally developed by Facebook to be something that's more flexible and more suited to common industry applications. So some of the advantages that they focused on when profit was being developed were things like interpretability. So because it's a time series decomposition, you get very clear interpretations for all of your estimates. You can interpret them as just a fixed effect, or as if you do multiplicatively, you can think of it as an elasticity. It handles non-stationarity much better than, or it makes fewer assumptions about stationarity compared to, say, ARIMA or sort of other families of models. And it also provides a much more realistic built-in structures for handling seasonal events and holidays and those kinds of disruptions, which are obviously important when you're modeling something like Ridership series. After fitting the models, so this is system-wide ridership recovery. So the black dots are the actual sort of measured system-wide ridership, and then the blue we have fitted the time series. So we can see it's a fairly good fit overall. So this is the full data with all components included. And again, I just want to call out the impact of the Omicron wave, which is this, this big dip that happened for a very short period of time before everyone came back. So this is what the overall time series looks like. Because we can extract individual components, this is what the trend component looks like. So first of all, I just want to highlight, there's no, because of the way profit handles disruptions, we're able to isolate the effect of that wave and remove it from the overall trend. So we're not unduly biasing what our estimates will be in the future. Because we don't expect there to be another Omicron wave, I hope.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. So based on the change points that profit was able to automatically fit and detect, we can actually think of this recovery in terms of 3 phases. So the first one I'll call the sort of pandemic phase. That represents the deepest phase when sort of ridership was at its lowest, and sort of everything was closed, everything was online. The next phase is the recovery. So that represents sort of the bulk of when the ridership recovery occurred from mid-2021 until late 2022. And the third component was, I don't know if it's the best name for it, but I call it the new normal, which is sort of after the rapid recovery sort of starts slowing down as we sort of reach kind of a new equilibrium. Or we can think about it that way. So because the profit model gives interpretable results, we can convert sort of the slopes for each of for the trend component into what is the average sort of recovery rate for each phase of the pandemic. And here I've broken this out by comparing travel within downtown, travel between downtown and the rest of the city, and travel outside of downtown, so the trips that don't touch downtown at all. So during the pandemic, ridership is decreasing obviously as everything is still shut down. What's interesting is that during the recovery phase, intra-downtown travel is the fastest to recover at about 2.6% of pre-COVID ridership per month into the strips, which is faster than the rest of the city. And even in the sort of third period, the new normal, it's still recovering at the fastest rate at about 0.8% per month, compared to the others, which, especially for the case of downtown to the rest of the city, that's almost stagnant now, based on what the models show. And then, this is consistent with what we know because travel within downtown was obviously the most heavily affected at the beginning of the pandemic, so it makes sense that it has sort of the furthest to recover, essentially. And it's doing so very quickly. And we can see my mouse is working. And we can see this as well by comparing the recovery of each of those categories I just talked about. So intra-downtown travel is in yellow. It starts out much lower than the others, but because it recovers much faster, it ends up actually overtaking travel between downtown and the rest of the city, which has, again, as I said, plateaued since late 2022. And again, I have the office occupancy plotted here just to reinforce that ridership due to office travel is still depressed, and so it's other factors that are driving this growth that are explaining the gap that we see. Something else we can get from these models we can look at the seasonality effects as well. So this is looking at the seasonality, the weekly effects, so differences between weekdays, and seeing how ridership varies here. So a lot of agencies have been reporting, that after COVID, because people now have the ability to, work from home or, do hybrid, they can choose which days of the week they come in, and so that results in Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays seeing much higher ridership than Mondays and Fridays, because people want to have like a longer weekend, basically. And so we see this as well here, especially the case for intra-downtown travel, which you can see is the lowest of 3 on Mondays and Fridays, but exceeds the other categories on the midweek days. And that's consistent because, again, downtown travel is sort of a lot more dependent on that kind of thing, whereas for travel within, for example, non-downtown regions, a lot of that travel is more things like essential employment or other employment that doesn't allow you to have that flexibility in terms of choosing which days you can travel, for example. So again, an interesting example of how we can see those effects in this data. So we did this analysis for every, we did sort of a similar thing for every, we did a model for every OD paired system. I'm not going to talk about all of them because there's 100 of them and we will run out of time. But we did sort of reviewing all of those models in aggregate, we identified sort of clusters of trajectories that were similar between different regions. So I just want to talk a little bit about that now. So the first cluster was regions pairs that have recovery trajectories that are very similar to the system as a whole. So for example, inter-downtown travel, where you have, again, these clearly defined pandemic recovery new normal periods that start and end at about the same time as the system as a whole. And these region pairs tend to be the busiest ones in the system. They tend to be the ones that therefore see very diverse, again, mix of trip purposes, and so they're very similar. They behave very similarly to how the system as a whole behaves. The second cluster is ones that have sort of a faster recovery, but followed by a plateau. So you see the recovery period is very rapid, but it sort of ends early on, and then it sort of peters off and sort of doesn't increase anymore. These are generally, these represent travel between downtown and suburban regions, which is again consistent because we saw that that kind of travel is the one that is kind of plateauing since the recovery phase ended. And something else that's interesting to note is that these region pairs tend to see, when we look at the seasonality, they don't have a strong effect for Septembers as most other region pairs do. That suggests that these have a much lower proportion of student travel, because other region pairs you tend to see a big bump every September, which we don't see with these. So that's another interesting effect as well. And the third cluster finally is those that have sort of slow and steady growth throughout the pandemic. So where there's not really any plateau and sort of the recovery is slow to begin with, but it continues at a slow rate throughout. These tend to be concentrated more in suburban areas. So the kind of travel that was less severely affected at the beginning of the pandemic, but which therefore has sort of come back slower as well because there's just less to, the recovery is less to recover, I guess. So in terms of some unique submarkets, so I wanted to call out this one in particular. I mentioned Region 10 earlier. It's one of the best performing submarkets in terms of travel demand. And there's some unique qualities of this submarket that I wanted to highlight. So first of all, Region 10 is the segment of Line 1 between Shepherd West and Vaughan Metropolitan Center. So it's actually the newest segment of the subway that was built. It only opened in 2017. What that means is that there was only about 2 years that this segment of the subway was open before COVID happened. And so a lot of the ridership recovery, you can argue, is actually due to sort of longer term shifts in travel behavior, adjusting to this new piece of infrastructure that opened. Another unique element is that Region 10 especially sees a fairly high proportion of low-income neighborhoods, essential workers, immigrant households and communities. And as I've talked about earlier, these are the same demographics that tend to use transit more consistently throughout the pandemic, even when COVID was sort of at its most widespread. And you can see that in fact that there's actually fairly little variation in ridership during the deepest part of COVID itself. So the overall trend is sort of a little bit different from what we see elsewhere. And finally, that one of the biggest destinations in Region 10 is York University, which is one of the single biggest transit trip generators in definitely the region, honestly probably the country. So it's obviously it drives a lot of student travel, and so we can see that is reflected in terms of how well correlated the overall trend is with events in the academic year. So we see this massive bump every single September, and then a drop off in April when classes end for the year. So again, it's more interesting results. Okay, so I'm going to end by talking a little bit about some of the forecasting work that we did. The objective of the forecasting work wasn't really to produce very robust estimates, but rather just as a little bit more exploratory to look at sort of the potential of profit for future forecasting and seeing if we can get some sort of like basic predictions that we can assess. So of course we start with the validation phase. We adopted a 6-month horizon for the forecasting, and that was based on a little bit of trial and error. Obviously, if you're a transit practitioner, you want to project out as far as you can in the future. But of course, the farther out you go, you sacrifice accuracy for, or your results become you become less confident in your results as you project further out. On the other hand, you do want to project out far enough that you can actually do anything with the data. So if you're a transit agency, you want to project out at least maybe a couple of board periods, for example. So you can actually plan accordingly. So 6 months was kind of best compromise between these factors. So we validated by simply looking at by simply chopping off the last 6 months of the data and seeing how well it performed. The overall error, room square percentage error, was at 12.6%. So could be better, but also it's not terrible given how given the available data, because we only had 3 years of post-COVID data to work with, which is means you still have a little bit of uncertainty in terms of seasonal effects and that kind of thing. We also saw variations when we modeled this broken out by different submarkets or different periods. So, like weekdays, for example, we saw smaller errors for weekdays compared to weekends. So that suggests that there's more that's driving ridership variations on weekends compared to weekdays. And likewise, downtown travel was more difficult to predict accurately compared to travel in the suburbs and compared to travel in suburbs. So again, that points to something. Something's happening in downtown that affects transit usage more than it does in the rest of the city. So we think, for example, things like special events, like major parades or festivals. Those are things that typically happen downtown on weekends. That could be one example of something that is affecting ridership in this way that's not accounted for here. So based on the validation, we went ahead and just did some prediction and just to see what happened. So this is for system. Yeah, this is for system-wide. From December 2023 to June 2024. So we predicted about 1 million daily weekday system-wide boardings. Actual TBC statistics that were reported by then. This was basically bang on in terms of ridership. So that's good. That lends confidence in the model and process. As for how different parts of the city are responding, we see that downtown, especially travel downtown, is really was forecasted to continue driving this growth, whereas, again, travel between downtown and the rest of the city is still kind of plateauing, and it's not really contributing to future ridership growth. Okay, so so just want to end with some conclusions and by recapping what I talked about. So, here's key findings. First of all, we demonstrated, I think, pretty clearly that Wi-Fi can be used to accurately and reliably track transit riders in terms of their origins and destinations. We can see that when we compare different parts of the city, downtown especially is very interesting. There's a lot of unique factors going on there. We saw the greatest ridership loss at the beginning of COVID, but it's also rebounded the fastest. And what we think is that a lot of that is driven by discretionary travel instead of commuting travel. We compare different areas again. We see that ridership is returning or not returning at different rates when we look at different parts of the city and different travel markets. We can see from our time series analysis that there's kind of 3 distinct phases when people reacted differently to different phases of the pandemic in terms of their transit riding behavior. And finally, that all of these observations are more or less all consistent with what else has been found in other research about the impact of transit and the pandemic, both in Canada and really like around the world. So again, that lends further confidence to these results. So, which is where we go from here. there are a number of interesting directions I think that this could lead into very clearly. So first of all, as I talked about in this time series modeling, we only had about 3 years of data, so getting some more data to augment that would be very nice. As well, we noticed that there are sort of still unexplained unexplained sources of variation within time series models. So identifying additional data sources that we could augment the models with could be another step to enhance the accuracy and predictive performance of these models. And that's obviously better if you want to use this in a practical setting, if you want to forecast that kind of stuff out in more detail. We also want to continue to refine the ODS estimation process. I didn't really touch on sort of the errata associated with that whole process here, but there are definitely opportunities to sort of improve some of the reliability there in terms of which trips are, in terms of greater filtering out of certain trips, or better sort of rebalancing that kind of stuff. We also want to better develop future forecasting capabilities. So ideally, for example, we would like to predict farther out than just 6 months. So for example, if we could adopt a 1-year time frame or even beyond that, that would be pretty impressive and obviously very useful for transit agencies. So more data again, or otherwise looking at different time series model specifications or different models entirely and seeing if they can produce better results farther out. And another thing I want to mention is all of this analysis so far is focused on the subway. That being said, we live in Toronto, our subway system does not cover a lot of the city, and so there is a lot of transit travel across the city that is being neglected by this analysis. And so as part of future work, it would obviously be very interesting to see if we can expand this kind of analysis, either using Wi-Fi or other analogous data sources, to the TTC's bus and streetcar system. There's a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of interesting results that could be found there that might agree or even disagree with what we're seeing here, and looking further into that and how COVID has affected the service network differently versus the subway network. Okay. It's my last slide, and it's focused towards more of a, I presented a lot of interesting results, but what does this mean if you're actually running a transit agency, for example? And so, in my opinion, there's a couple of key takeaways that I want to talk about. First of all, redesign transit networks. We know that travel patterns have changed significantly, and so a lot of the service models or a lot of the network design choices that made sense before COVID might not make sense anymore. Especially, there's a lot of peak commuter services that are still running but don't have much ridership, and so there's a question: are those resources better allocated elsewhere in the system? In the example of the TTC, the TTC used to run before COVID premium fare downtown express buses from various suburbs, which COVID was basically used as an excuse to permanently suspend, so they could reallocate those resources towards other parts of the network, other parts of the bus network where those services were would be better used. And at a regional level, of course, there's a big project going on, Go Expansion, which is sort of a very similar aim to transform the Go network from a very peak downtown commuting-focused rail system into one that has frequent service both ways, all day, 7 days a week, so you can rely on it for a much greater variety of trip purposes. And so, obviously, these things were sort of underway before COVID as well, but COVID and the associated changes in travel behavior would really multiply the benefits that we can achieve from those kinds of transformations. Another change would be to adjust planning policies and fare policies that agencies have. A lot of these are still based on sort of what the reality of transit ridership and what people's travel behaviors looked like before COVID. But now we've seen that people, they use transit for a different variety of trips, and you see that people use transit less frequently in general, but to a greater variety of destinations, for example. And so the question of, are the old set of, say, fare products, are they still relevant? Are they still attractive towards riders? And so there's been studies that found, for example, that offering new fare products could be a good way to lure people back onto transit. So that could be something else that agencies can look into. Another one is looking at new data sources. So we're well into the era of big data. So a lot of agencies are sort of swimming in data now. But the question is, how do we marry these up with the questions that agencies need to answer? I mean, in my research, I think I've been able to show that Wi-Fi data has a lot of potential in terms of being able to answer some really interesting questions that are really relevant towards how agencies seek run the networks. So this is, again, just a question of seeing how they can marry up the data they have, or adopting new data sources, such as Wi-Fi, or even other data sources, and using those to address their needs. And a final one is sort of rethinking or reconceptualizing what recovery even kind of means. Like I've shown, I hope, if you guys can, like I've shown throughout this whole presentation that really the ridership recovery has been proceeding differently in a wide variety of markets. And it's been proceeding differently. And so that begs the question of, is recovery sort of one process, or is it multiple smaller processes that are all running in parallel? So does it still make sense to talk about recovery as sort of a single concept, I guess? It's also worth pointing out that some travel markets have already reached 100% of pre-COVID levels, and now they're well on the way to 130, 150%. Meanwhile, there's other kinds of travel which have stayed at about 70 or 80 and then have just stayed there. So they're not really recovering either. So does it still make sense to talk about recovery, to talk about either of those? So it really begs the question of what does recovery even mean in this context? Given that we're almost 5 years out from COVID, from when COVID first started, it's perhaps time to really rethink of should we still be chasing what 2019 or what pre-COVID levels are when we design our transit networks, and instead treat what transit agencies are dealing with right now as a new baseline to talk about things like the future of transit and where we go from here. So that concludes my presentation. Before I end, I just want to have acknowledgements, of course. So I would like to thank the AI, which has been acquired by Rogers, and the TTC for giving us data access, especially Yusuf and Herman, who were very helpful and providing support for that stuff. And of course, I would like to thank my supervisor, Professor Amer Shalaby, as well as Diego for providing a lot of really helpful supervision and insights and guidance during this whole process.